Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the San Anselmo Library's Virtual Art Talk Tuesday, the wide, wild world of surrealism. I'm Sariana, the Adult Services Librarian at the San Anselmo Library, and before we begin, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Library Parcel Tax for sponsoring this program and all of our library programs. Everyone will remain muted throughout the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, and we will answer all questions at the end of the presentation. Technology can be very fickle, and I want to thank you all in advance for your patience and understanding during this program. We will be recording this program today, and I will send out the link to everyone who is registered. Our next art talk will be The Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England on Tuesday, July 11th at 12 p.m. This will be a hybrid program, so please join us either in the council chambers or on Zoom. Our speaker today is Avril Angevine. Avril is an arts lecturer with a particular interest in modern, contemporary, and California art. She has spoken on many subjects at various locations in the Bay Area, including the OLLI programs at Cal State East Bay, Dominican College, San Francisco State, and the Fromm Institute. Avril has a BA in English and an MA in Comparative Literature from UC Berkeley and taught English and Humanities at local colleges. She's also a museum guide at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and a docent at the Oakland Museum of California. Please join me in welcoming Avril Angevine.
Yay! Oh, Sariana, that's a lovely. Didn't expect that. Well, welcome everybody. Here we are. All on Zoom this time, to have a look at one of the most fascinating isms of all the 20th century art isms, that is surrealism. The Surrealists created some of the most memorable images and objects of all times, things that you can't forget, right? They're in your mind. Once you've seen them, they stay with you. And although the movement started in France, it had a worldwide reach, as we will see today. So fasten your seatbelts for a wild ride. So first of all, I'd like to start with a little bit of background. Where did surrealism come from and why did it appear the way it did? Well, the late 19th century, of course, saw technological changes of staggering consequences to human life, disruptive as the computer and social media revolutions have been in our lives, and now ChatGPT is disrupting even further. So beginning with things like the railroad, the electric light, the refrigerator, things that made life easier for people, there were things that were unheard of, like airplanes and the movies, snapshot photography. People were fascinated by these things and some were shocked. But just as important, ideas about everything from how the universe operates to what's really going on in the human mind, all of these were opening doors to new ways of thought and expression. Now, artists, who are the most sensitive among us for sure, sought new artistic expressions suitable to the disruption of the times. So, for example, Impressionism, which used the bright colors of newly developed chemical paints to depict the changing play of light on objects, as Claude Monet did in his series of paintings of Rouen Cathedral at different times of day and different seasons and so forth. So showing that a thing is not the same all the time, that light changes how it looks. So they had sort of a scientific understanding of art in a way. Other early century art movements like Cubism and Futurism were also disrupting centuries-old art techniques, perspective, modeling, and so forth, in an attempt to capture the spirit of the times they were living in. Now, not all of these artists were necessarily hostile to the changing world. The futurists like Marinetti there liked speed and liked changes and so forth. But the shocking disruption of the First World War, when machine guns, hand grenades, poison gas, flamethrowers, tanks, and airplanes were used in combat for the first time, created a shock much greater than the appearance of automobiles and typewriters. And in fact, it was such a shock that the war produced a group of 20-something World War I vets who, around 1922, launched a lawsuit against reality. There they are, and I'm sure you recognize right in the center, that's Salvador Dali. These guys were in rebellion against the materialistic bourgeois world with its belief in the power of science and technology, the worldview they thought that had produced the war. They lived their rebellion, aimed to overthrow the rational and thus solve all the principal problems of life, as André Breton put it, by effecting social and cultural change. And in the meantime, they produced some mind-blowing, irrational art which continues to fascinate us today. Now, what really distinguishes the Surrealists from the many other art directions in the 20th century is that the Surrealists are interested in the content of their paintings, which usually means the depiction of objects juxtaposed in surprising, even unsettling ways, rather than the formal problems of painting, which is what many artists in the early 20th century were about. So while some artists are becoming increasingly concerned with the possibilities of painting, surrealists aren't really concerned with the flatness of the image, the true depiction of light effects, revealing the underlying structure of objects, and so on. They're concerned with content, but not the content typical of the Western art tradition. Nor do they like portraits, landscapes, or still life paintings. They're not interested in that. Nor do they really depict the toll of modern life on the individual or man's inhumanity to man. Although they supported anarchy and revolution, they began looking to the mind as a source of social liberation. And they experimented with practices that allowed them to explore subconscious thought and identity and bypass restrictions placed on people by social conventions. Here's the artist Man Ray recording a waking dream. And during waking dream seances, group members would place themselves into a trance state and recite visions and poetic passages with an immediacy that denied any fakery. The Surrealists who did this insisted that theirs was a scientific pursuit and not like similar techniques used by spiritualists claiming to communicate with the dead. So these artists aim to depict the irrational, hallucinatory dream images or fantasies, or images produced by free association. Their concern with their content is why their titles are so important. René Magritte's well-modeled rendering of objects, like his famous non-pipe, are at the far end of this spectrum, with the most irrational content and yet the least attention to a modern impressionistic or expressionistic style. Now, in their works, these young poets and artists wanted to reunite modern man and woman with the forces of the unconscious and to question the state of art, politics, and society, and anything else they could think of. Surrealism was at first a literary movement, and many of its operations are ideally suited to poetry, such as automatic writing, in which the writer tries to work directly from the unconscious, sort of the way a Ouija board works. The poets also scattered random words on paper or played the game of exquisite corpse, in which each member adds to a work without knowing what her predecessor had done. And there's a work produced by 4 artists in that way, that they don't know what the previous person did, and it creates a random sensation. Painters, of course, as I said, mimic these techniques using such strategies as the random dropping of objects onto the canvas, collage or fautage, and things like that. Now, not coincidentally, Surrealism, with its focus on the unconscious, appeared at the very moment when Sigmund Freud's works were being translated into French. André Breton, who had been a doctor in the neurology department of a hospital in Nantes during World War I, began recording the dreams of mental patients. To him, Freud's description of the operation of the subconscious mind provided proof that the psyche could indeed replace rational thought in artistic expression. Now, though he inspired them, there's a sketch of Freud by Salvador Dali. Though he inspired them, Freud claimed not to understand surrealism. Now, all the early surrealists were interested in women as objects of desire. The problem of woman, Andre Breton wrote in 1929, is the most marvelous and disturbing problem in all the world. And we can see on this cover of the Second Surrealist Manifesto how interested they are in women. I do not see the woman hidden in the forest, it says. But the greatest work of art for a true surrealist was her own life. The surrealists cultivated their personalities as studiously as the romantics had back in Lord Byron's day. The surrealists were bold eccentrics who used their own lives as a way of flaunting and taunting society. So they were early hippies. Andre Breton, for example, affected a monocle on some days and green spectacles on others. The composer Erik Satie only ate white foods, and by this he meant eggs, sugar, rice, shredded bones, the fat of dead animals, things like that. And surely the most eccentric of all was Salvador Dali. His escapades are legendary. The first time he arrived in New York, he was carrying a 2.5 meter long loaf of bread. He once wore a suit decorated with artificial flies, and he arrived at an event in a Rolls Royce filled with cauliflower. At the London Surrealist Show of 1936, Dali lectured on paranoia. Here he is, from deep inside a deep sea diving suit. He failed to attach the air supply, and as his air ran out, he began to struggle, but the crowd applauded. They thought it was part of the act. When the helmet was smashed open with a hammer, he emerged, delighted by his really deathly pallor. And the Daily Mirror of London reported that attendees came away shocked, amused, scared, and some of them just bored. So since we're here, let's start with Salvador Dali, one of the most versatile and prolific artists of the 20th century and one of the most famous surrealists. He did it all: painting, sculpture, printmaking, fashion, advertising, writing, and even filmmaking in his collaborations with Luis Buñuel and with Alfred Hitchcock. He designed the dream sequences in the movie Spellbound. Dali was renowned for his flamboyant personality and activities as a mischievous provocateur, as much as for his undeniable technical skill. His work bears the stamp of the Catalan countryside, and his paintings betray a fascination for classical and Renaissance art, clearly visible in his hyper-realistic style and the religious symbolism of his later work. But obsessive themes of eroticism, death, and decay permeate Dali's work, reflecting his familiarity with and synthesis of the psychoanalytical theories of his time. Dali subscribed to surrealist Andre Breton's theory of automatism, but ultimately opted for what he called a paranoiac critical state, in which one could simulate delusion while maintaining sanity. And so he said, "The only difference between me and a madman is that I am not mad." Well, that's what he claims anyway. Now, Dali called this irrational knowledge, a method applied by his contemporaries to various media, ranging from cinema to poetry to fashion. Now, Dali was born near Barcelona to a prosperous middle-class family. The first son in the family, also named Salvador, died early. The young artist was often told that he was the reincarnation of his dead brother, an idea that surely planted crazy notions in this impressionable child. His larger-than-life persona blossomed early alongside his interest in art. In 1922, he enrolled at the San Fernando School in Madrid of Art, where Goya had taught and where Picasso, and for that matter, Oscar de la Renta, also studied. And he started to confidently inhabit his provocative persona. His eccentricity was notorious, and he experimented with many different art styles at the time. He was friends with Luis Buñuel, the filmmaker, and poet Federico Garcia Lorca, and was exposed to the most important ideas of the time. He then took a life-changing trip to Paris. This happens to lots of artists. He visited Pablo Picasso in his studio, found inspiration in both Cubism and Futurism, and he began to study the psychoanalytic concepts of Freud and began using psychoanalytic methods of mining the subconscious in order to generate imagery, working to reinterpret reality and alter perception. His first serious work in this style was this one, Apparatus and Hand, or Hand and Apparatus from 1927, which contained the symbolic imagery and sort of dreamlike landscape that would become Dali's inimitable painting signature. So most of his paintings look as though they are a landscape, as this one does. They often have a slightly erotic tinge to them, as this one does, and they have a symbology that may or may not be evident to viewers. The cane that's supporting the figure is supposed to be showing the fragility of sleep, for example. Okay, and the ants that are at the bottom, ants are a frequent symbol of decay in his work. Okay, let's go on. Here's another, The Great Masturbator from 1929. Now, in Dali's youth, apparently, his father left out on the coffee table a book with explicit photos of people suffering from advanced, untreated venereal diseases to educate the boy. The photos of grotesquely damaged and diseased genitalia fascinated and horrified young Dali, as they might many young boys, and he continued to associate sex with putrefaction and decay into his adulthood. Now, it's interesting to compare Dali's work to that of somebody like Hieronymus Bosch. And it's interesting that the Prado Museum in Madrid has a large collection of Bosch. So that's somebody that Dali would have known as a young student. Here's the famous Persistence of Memory. Was inspired by the vision of a camembert cheese melting in the sun. Now, the distinction between hard and soft objects highlights Dali's desire to flip reality, lending to his subjects characteristics opposite their usual inherent properties, as happens sometimes in our dreams. They are, once again, these cheese watches, if that's what they are surrounded by a swarm of ants, hungry for these organic processes of putrefaction and decay with which Dali held this fascination. It's an odd work, The Enigma of William Tell. William Tell, of course, shot an arrow, shot an apple off his son's head. Here, the father is holding a baby, and I doubt that you can see this, but the baby has a lamb chop on its head. In a twist in this theme of paternal assault, the father figure looks to be about to eat the baby, and the birds down in the bottom are just waiting for the leftovers. Dali had a tumultuous relationship with his family at the time that he made this painting. He had been virtually disowned by his father for his relationship with his wife Gala, who is supposedly represented by the tiny nut right next to the father's big foot, in danger of being stomped out. Now, this artwork also served as a bit of a turning point in Dali's relationship with the Surrealist group. The main body of them, most of the Surrealists, led by André Breton, were leftists with supporters of Lenin in Russia, while Dali here gives the evil father figure the face of Lenin. Now, here's a famous object we started out with, the lobster telephone. Dali collector Edward James commissioned this and had 4 made for his own house. James also commissioned the Mae West lips sofa from Dali, here it is, which is simply a large pair of lips that serve as a couch. The sexual connotations of sitting down on this can be easily imagined, right? Now, Dali lived in France throughout the Spanish Civil War, 36 through 39, and he was a supporter of Franco before he left for the United States in 1940, where he achieved commercial success. He returned to Spain in 1948, where he announced his return to the Catholic faith and developed his nuclear mysticism style based on his early interests in classicism, mysticism, and recent scientific developments. Now, there's a Dali museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. It seems an appropriate place for it. And there's a private collection, has one in Monterey, California, that has almost 600 works. The Dalis lived in Monterey during World War II when they were here in the United States. And he died in 1988 at 84. So he lived a long, fruitful life, very interesting life. Now, famous surrealist number 2, or number 1, maybe Dali's number 2, is Rene Magritte. And he has some interesting similarities with Dali, and of course, some significant differences. Both were part of the Parisian surrealist crowd, but both parted from them. Both men had lifelong supportive partners, and both were impeccable craftspersons who remained tethered to an old-fashioned rendering of objects through modeling, perspective, and the other artistic strategies that deceive us into accepting painted objects as real ones. But of course, Dali used his skills to create fantastic, dreamlike images, while Magritte depicts the objects of everyday life, but combined in irrational ways. In fact, Magritte may have been the most radical of all of them, as he investigates the mysteries of life, as he puts it in his art. He was born in 1898. His father was a tailor and his mother a milliner, and he spent his youth in several small Belgian towns until 1916, when he began to study at the Academy of Fine Arts in Brussels. Oh yes, Magritte, like Hercule Poirot, is a Belgian, not a Frenchman. Very little is known about his childhood, although some interesting anecdotes have been passed down. In one of them, a very young Magritte recalls seeing some balloonists who had unexpectedly landed on the roof of his family's apartment building and who carried their deflated balloons down the stairwell. Magritte's first encounter, he said, with the sensation of mystery. But presumably the most long-lasting and powerful episode of his childhood concerns the suicide of his mother by drowning in a local river when Magritte was 13. When her body was retrieved from the river, her nightdress had floated up to cover her face. So the covered face or head is an image that Magritte used in several paintings of the late 20s, like The Lovers. I have that here. Whoops, wrong one. Magritte steadfastly denied that her death influenced him at all, an attitude consistent with his general refusal to acknowledge Freudian psychoanalysis, an attitude which separated him from the surrealist crowd, and to insist that his images did not come from the murky depth of the unconscious, but instead present lucid, clearly accessible works, dreams not intended to make you sleep, but to wake you up, as he said. Psychology concerns itself with false mysteries. The only real mystery is the world, is what he said. Now, young Magritte cuts classes at the Academy and begins work as a commercial artist, which he returned to at various points in his life, designing wallpaper and advertising posters. His earliest paintings are influenced by Cubism and Futurism. And after a brief stint in the army, he marries the beautiful Georgette Berger in 1922, and they move into an apartment in Brussels. Except for a brief stay in Paris, this inseparable couple will live in Brussels for the rest of their lives. Magritte is part of Brussels' avant-garde scene, if that's not an oxymoron, and he's attracted to the provocative, absurdist unconventionality of Dada. And his breakthrough comes in 1925 when he sees the work of Giorgio de Chirico, an Italian painter of metaphysical landscapes. And by his own account, Magritte is moved to tears by this work. With de Chirico as an inspiration and Georgette as his muse, Magritte sets to work in earnest. In the exciting transitional year of 1926, Magritte paid 60 or so canvases. He feels that technique plays only an incidental role, and in fact, these early works aren't the masterful images he later produces. But he's decided that he's a poet, really, rather than a painter, a poet who uses a canvas and images rather than words to make a statement. From 26 to 30, Magritte is under contract to a Brussels dealer, and he produces a quarter of his lifetime output in oil paint, 280 works in these 4 years. That's rather staggering. His first exhibit in Brussels in 1927 is received coolly, but Magritte and Georgette leave for a 3-year residence in Paris, the beating heart of Surrealism. Now, Magritte's desire to investigate the mysteries of reality through shocking conjunctions totally lines up with Surrealist goals. And in fact, his search for disturbing poetic effects sounds uncannily like Freud's description of the uncanny, the feeling of repulsion and distress produced by something long hidden that comes to light, something strangely familiar rather than simply mysterious. Freud's examples of the uncanny sound very much like Magritte's: doubles, dismembered limbs, dead things that may be alive, or live things that may in fact be dead. And in the 20s and 30s, Magritte's imagery is often morbid and dark. It won't surprise you that he's interested in Edgar Allan Poe. In this work, Young Girl Eating a Bird, subtitled Pleasure of 1928, we see Magritte's typical shallow space and simplified background that gives us spectators no way to escape, and the jarring contrast between the nicely dressed bourgeois girl and her behavior. This was actually inspired by seeing his wife eating a chocolate bird. And among the most memorable images of these years are the hooded figures that may or may not be traced back to the death of his mother, like The Lovers, famous one, or Central History, or heads up, trigger warning here for Symmetry Trick from 1928. Now, Magritte always denied symbolic interpretations for his work, which would, as he said, explain away the poetics of mystery. But by the end of the 30s, he had developed a repertoire of strategies, images, and subjects that will characterize his work from then on. He will generally include two or more objects that have a poetic association. Among his strategies, we'll notice, in addition to the odd juxtapositions, changes in scales and stuff, various forms of metamorphosis, like this, one thing turning into another. Fossilization, he likes that. Is that a live thing that may be dead? What he calls simultaneity, at the same time. Straight up copying, Manet's balcony. And a painting within a painting. So these last two reflect on the processes of art. This is so interesting, which fascinates us, brings up so many questions about paintings, about perception, about expectation. What is behind the painted work there? And on the subject of confounding conventional usage, let's consider Magritte's perplexing word and image pictures, the most famous of which is, of course, the treason of image, that this is not a pipe, this is a picture of a pipe. Magritte painted 32 word and picture images during his stay in Paris. They're based on French children's books. The script that he used is typical of them. So this one, the interpretation of the dreams, which has images and words that don't correspond, sort of commenting on the irrationality of names, in most cases. Despite his commitment to mystery and strangeness, the Parisian surrealist life didn't quite suit Magritte, the man forever linked to the bourgeois bowler hat. In fact, even in Paris, he and Georgette lived in a suburb. Many commentators referred to Georgette's middlebrow taste in clothing and furnishings and so forth. So by 1930, Magritte had fallen afoul of the Parisian surrealists. As the story goes, the last straw came when André Breton criticized Georgette for wearing so bourgeois a symbol as a crucifix on her necklace. The Magrittes returned to Brussels, once again to an apartment in the suburbs, where they lived the rest of their lives and where Magritte painted in the living room, so carefully that he can paint in the living room. By 1933, Magritte had developed yet another way of working, providing a connection between objects that's obvious once made. Where he once shocked by unrelated images, now the shock comes from the object's connection. Here are a couple of them, like this: elective affinities, the cage and the egg, yes. And once again, the rape, one of the images that you can't unsee once you see it. And again, these connections are not unlike the way Freud defines the uncanny. After World War II, when Magritte did some very, very odd works that we're not going to look at today, he produced what we must consider his masterworks. His work in this decade is characterized by hypertrophy, which is the opposite of atrophy. So instead of shrinking down, making large, jarring alteration of scale among familiar objects to create an unnerving effect, as in Personal Values, the first one I showed you that's at SF MoMA. So we have like the listening room. And once again, what's really difficult about Magritte is that the titles have nothing to do with what's depicted in the picture. So they're hard to remember. There's the listening room. And it's an example of his hypertrophy. Let's finish with some more of the late great works. Son of Man, which began as a self-portrait, as a selfie. And Golconda, or It's Raining Men in Brussels, as I like to call it. And The Dominion of Light, famous image, one of many that Magritte reworked many times. This one he did 17 times, all of them with the same title. This is the first image he did after World War II, and it was sold to Nelson Rockefeller. Now, Magritte's images have had as long a career as Dali's have, appearing on album covers and in advertising for decades. This Is Not a Pipe has had a particularly long career. That's there. I love this one. This is not an ad for shoes, really. Or this is not a peep, and it is a peep. So fun. So these are the top two surrealists, the ones that people know really well and whose work has been in culture, as I said, all over the place. But there are lots of lesser known surrealists, and I'd like to turn to a couple who are just as fascinating. They thrived in Paris, but we're going to see we can find them all over the globe. And I want to start with a couple of women who found their outlet in surreal images despite the decided sexism of the originators of surrealism. And interestingly, these women were all connected to the Brad Pitt, I guess, of the surrealist crowd, Max Ernst. First is Merit Oppenheim, creator of two of the most fantastic and most female of surrealist constructions. There she is in a photo by Man Ray. She was born in 1913, and she grew up in Switzerland in a progressive intellectual family. Her father was a psychoanalyst, and he recommended that she record her dreams, which she did throughout her life, providing an important source of inspiration. By her late teens, Oppenheim was beginning to find life in Switzerland a little confining, and she went to Paris, where she took art classes and met Picasso, Giacometti, and John Arp, artists twice her age. In 1933, she exhibited her first sculpture, a turning point in her career and a breakthrough actually for the surrealists, who so far had not allowed women to participate as artists. But Merit Oppenheim was caught in the same trap as a number of artistic women, both in the surrealist crowd and earlier. Her beauty provided the entree to artists and art circles. Man Ray, as you can see here, photographed her extensively, and she struggled to get behind the lens. In 1937, she abruptly ended a blazing affair with Max Ernst when she realized that this romantic entanglement would end her career. In the late 30s, she began working with the fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli, creating clothes, accessories, and jewelry that suggest personal transformation. Schiaparelli also worked with Jean Cocteau, who worked with Salvador Dali, actually. The fur bracelet has a great story, which is that it was suggested to Oppenheim by Picasso when they were having lunch together in a cafe. And she actually made it work out. And she went from there to this. So Picasso suggested the fur bracelet. Once she did that, Dali actually suggested she apply fur to other things. And she did the wonderful fur breakfast in 1936 that was purchased by Albert Barr, the original director of MoMA, New York. She wanted 1,000 French francs. He counter-offered $50, which was about half, and he bought it for the museum, but it was not shown until the 1960s. Another work of hers, Ma Gouvernante, involves nearly every imaginable sexual fetish, bondage, foot fetishing, and so forth. The oval form of the tray and the crevice between the shoes is vaguely vaginal. The white shoes and their scuffed up appearance might reference the Madonna and whore complex that troubles women in this type of view. A female spectator flew into a rage and smashed the original work when it first appeared at an exhibition in Paris in 1936. So this is a recreated version. As she became more famous, she became rather insecure, and in the late 30s, she fell into depression, and though she continued to work, she didn't exhibit. But after marriage in 1945, her life settled down, things began to improve, and by the mid-50s, she would work and exhibit again. When she finally understood that a creative body of work is only possible with an absolutely stable sense of confidence. And she rejected both of the labels that are most frequently applied to her, feminist and surrealist. She refused to participate in exhibitions of women's art. It's a lovely little work of hers that you've probably seen at SF MoMA, Miss Gardenia. And here's a similar one, A Distant Relative. She died in 1985 in her 70s, having made a solid impact on modern art, despite how little of her art was ever shown. So another member of Max Ernst's crowd, his coterie, was Remedios Varo. She produced these meticulously rendered, meaning-filled, symbolic works that honed in on features of a woman's life. Not so easy to do in the face of the sexism and objectification of women so prevalent in the work of the male surrealists. She was born in Northeast Spain in 1908. Her father, who was an engineer, recognized her artistic talent early and had her reproduce his engineering sketches. He also introduced her to the work of Edgar Allan Poe, Alexandre Dumas, and Hieronymus Bosch, and to mysticism, science, and philosophy. Her mother, in contrast, was a devout Catholic, and at 15, her parents enrolled her at the art school in Madrid, alma mater of Salvador Dali and Picasso, but she rebelled against it all: the formal instruction in the school, her father's expectations, and her mother's religious ideology. And in fact, at 19, she escaped. She eloped with a fellow student and went to Paris. She left him to pursue a bohemian lifestyle, hanging out with the Surrealists with whom she exhibited, and with Max Ernst. She didn't produce too much in her Paris years, but after emigrating to Mexico on one of the last ships allowed to leave the country before World War II, so in 1939, she flourished. Mexico, of course, was a very surreal place in the late 1930s, and there Varo created a rich new creative life among other expatriate artists and intellectuals, and she became particularly close with the surrealist Leonora Carrington. Her drawings and paintings explore otherworldly narrative scenes, as you can see here, characterized by a protagonist, often female, usually female, encountering some supernatural forces, as in creation of the birds. I mean, there's so much going on in here. I mean, how do you create a bird? So this is kind of like a monk cell. This wise woman owl is using light that's shining through a prism to create birds. The colors are coming from this alchemical device from the outside. Very, very interesting things going on. Music is part of this too. In another painting, interesting one, Mimesis, this is fascinating. A woman is depicted who Varo said has remained motionless for so long that she is turning into the armchair. So notice her hands are becoming like the arms of a chair. Meanwhile, the furniture is coming to life, right? So there's the opposition and the forces, opposing forces mixing together. The chair in the corner is reaching into the dresser. And of course, we have the little cat peeking out from under the floor, perhaps a symbol for all her stifled primal urges and repressed female rebellion. There we go. By the time of Varro's death in 1963, she had created over 500 works, most of them produced in Mexico. She died in 1963 at the height of her success. Her posthumous retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City in 1971 surpassed attendance records there for shows by Diego Rivera and David Siqueiros. Now, her friend, Leonora Carrington, came from a well-to-do British background, but she was rebellious and artistic from the get-go, discovering Surrealism in an exhibition when she was 10. Her works are perhaps less dense than Varro's, but they're full of this enigmatic symbolism. Here's an artist in a dramatic interior extending an open hand to a female hyena, and we can see why we know it's a female. She was interested in presenting female sexuality as she experienced it, rather than the way that male surrealists characterized it. And she, like Magritte, was not interested in Freud. She too had a short-lived romance with Max Ernst. There's the two of them in a photo by Lee Miller, who left Carrington behind when he fled to the United States with Peggy Guggenheim in 1939. Carrington then experienced a mental breakdown, but after recuperating, she too emigrated to Mexico, resumed painting, and established herself as an integral feature in the Surrealist movement, which was strong in Mexico. She died in 2011 at age 94 in Mexico City. And her work in the 40s is focused on the underlying theme of women's role in the creative process too. So here's the old maids. She manages to equate the domestic sphere with magical practices of diverse cultures, so that the nursery, the kitchen garden, and so on were transformed from sites of drudgery and oppression into places of power. Varro and Carrington enjoyed studying alchemy, magic, the tarot, and astrology, and these themes intricately lace their works together, as we see in Friday here. What an imagination it took to take these ordinary surroundings into the realm of the uncanny. Now, the final member of the Friends of Max Club is the American Dorothea Tanning. Her early works, paintings such as Ein kleine Nachtmusik here, were precise, figurative rendings of dreamlike situations. Did she also read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe? I bet. She also read many Gothic and Romantic novels as a young girl. In Galesburg, Illinois, where she was born. She moved to New York in 1935, where she supported herself as a commercial artist while working on her own paintings. Like Carrington, she was introduced to Surrealism at an exhibition, in this case, MoMA's seminal 1936 exhibition, Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism. Her boss, who was the art director at Macy's, introduced her to her gallery owner, who gave Tanning 2 solo exhibitions, and more importantly, introduced her to the circle of émigré surrealists whose work he was showing, including the German painter Max Ernst. She met him when he came to her studio looking for work to include in Peggy Guggenheim's gallery, Art of This Century. And another photograph by Lee Miller sort of shows it all, tells it all. Max Ernst towering over all these women he was involved with. As Tanning told it, Ernst was enchanted by her iconic self-portrait, Birthday, here it is. The two played chess, fell in love, began a 30-year marriage in 1946, and embarked on a life together that took them to Sedona, Arizona, and later to France. So this self-portrait in Sedona, which of course is known for its red rocks, here we can say that the dramatic landscape kind of forced Tanning to tune out the surrounding, what she called decibels of nature, which she found to be crushing, and instead turn to fantasy. Isn't that the artist's best joy, she remarked, to rival the sun and moon, to turn their logic upside down. Throughout the 40s, she continued to paint depictions of unreal scenes, some of which combined erotic subjects with enigmatic symbols and desolate space. Over the next decade, her painting evolved, becoming more suggestive, increasingly fragmented and prismatic in works like this one, Insomnia. So now she's practically an abstractionist. After Ernst's death in 1976, Tanning returned to New York, where she continued to create art and poetry, working and publishing until the end of her life, which did not occur until 2012 when she was 101 years old. So we're going to stay over here in the Western Hemisphere for a while so I can introduce you to Wilfredo Lam. He was born in 1902 in Sagua La Grande, Cuba, son of a Chinese father and a mother of mixed African, Indian, and European descent. In 1916, he attended the art school in Havana, but by 1923, he moved to Madrid, where he, like Remedios Varo and probably like Salvador Dali, became fascinated by the works of Brash, which I said there are many of in the Prado. In 1929, he married. His wife and their young son died of tuberculosis 2 years later, and this tragic event may well have contributed to the dark and brooding appearance of much of Lam's later work. In 1936, a traveling Picasso exhibition proved inspirational to Lam, both artistically and politically. He moved to Paris in 1938, where Picasso took him under his wing and encouraged his interest in African art and primitive masks. Lam also traveled to Mexico, Surrealist hotspot, where he stayed with Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. His own multicultural heritage and his involvement with Santeria, a religion rooted in African culture, would soon become integral to his work. And by the late 30s, he was associated with the Surrealists, who considered modern primitive cultures, as they styled them, to have an understanding of myth and reality, which they themselves hoped to achieve. Lam, being of African, Chinese, and European descent, seemed to the Surrealists to have privileged access to that state of mind. He had his first show in Paris in 1939, and he was often exhibited with Picasso in New York. So in a work like The Jungle, he aimed to convey the haunting consequences of slavery and colonialism for his native island of Cuba. These figures have faces that recall African or Pacific Islander masks against a background of, as you can see, the Cuban sugarcane fields. And in fact, in many ways, this reminds me of the Demoiselle d'Avignon, Picasso's breakout work, which also uses a display of figures, some of whom have African-style masks over their faces. Lam said, "I wanted with all my heart to paint the drama of my country, to disturb the dreams of the exploiters." Here's a figure partly inspired by the horse-headed woman, the femme cheval of the Santeria cult. Different body parts changing from one thing to another to suggest magical metamorphosis inspired by indigenous ritual objects. Up at the top there's the head of the horse, and that is considered a testicle chin, which you might not have picked up on if I didn't mention it to you. It's kind of a conflation of both genders. Now, during World War II, Lam spent most of his time in the Caribbean and was eventually back in Havana in 1941. His first year in Cuba marked a watershed in his artistic practice. He was introduced to the theories of Carl Jung, and like New York's abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock, he was fascinated by Jung, and he created his own style by fusing Surrealism and Cubism with the spirit and forms of the Caribbean. He traveled and married extensively and died in 1982 in Paris. Now, going even further south, we can meet the Chilean Roberto Mata, who was born in 1911. He studied architecture and moved to Paris to work in the studio of Le Corbusier. While he was there, he traveled to Madrid, where he met Salvador Dali, who encouraged him to show his architectural drawings to André Breton and to become an artist. As an accepted member of the Surrealist group, Mata moved to New York in 1938 and started oil painting. Now, in his work, as you can see, organic and cosmic life forms and the psyche of the artist are explored through Surrealist methods like automatism. Like André Breton, Mata believed that art was political, and he combined the political with semi-abstraction, influencing New York's abstract expressionists in the years running up to World War II. There's a few more of his works. Snail's Trace. And this is more typical of Mata, a grave situation. And finally, The beautiful roses, les roses sont belles. I am interested only in the unknown, and I work for my own astonishment, he once declared. Now, scandal cut short his time in New York, as he was blamed by many for the death of his friend Arshil Gorky, as Mata had slept with Gorky's wife. Because of this, he was ostracized and returned to Europe, dividing his time between Paris and Rome, and he died in 2002 at the age of 91. And since we're on the continent, let's go home. Let's go to California. Let's go to Berkeley. A California surrealist, a member of the Bay Area's powerful mid-century artistic clan, is Charles Howard. Howard, who had an international reputation during his lifetime, has, in my view, been undeservedly sidelined. He was the son of John Galen Howard, the architect who designed so many buildings on the Berkeley campus, like Doe Library, Wheeler Hall, the Greek Theater, the Campanile. Charles's mother and his three brothers were all artists. His brother Henry was an architect who helped design Coit Tower. John Langley Howard, whose work is in the Coit Tower, and Robert Howard, who was a sculptor and architect. Charles actually attended Berkeley High and UC Berkeley, and despite having trained as a journalist, he became an artist. He was active in England, where he came into contact with contemporary European art, and came back to San Francisco in 1940. First war winter here was completed here, and he was embraced by the local art community. He achieves a beautiful fusion of two opposing forces in his work, one rational and obsessed with order, the other exploring chaos and the depths of the unconscious. His work, though, has greater connection with biological, I think, than psychological processes, and his works are often dark and surreal, but they manage somehow to put the viewer at ease, at least this viewer anyway. Most of his pieces depict a landscape, as is the case with Dali, shown in a state of metamorphosis. He claimed at one point that all of his paintings are closely related. They are all, in fact, portraits of the same general subject, the same idea, carried as far as I am able to at the time, he said. But of course, he never disclosed what that idea might be, though, leaving it up to the viewer's interpretation. A few more of his works, which I really, really like. And Prescience. There we see the lips of Salvador Dali there a little bit. Howard returned to England in 1946, and he developed an austere kind of minimalism using only black, white, and gray, and eventually moved to Italy, where he died in 1978. Now, besides all the paintings and the objects we've seen, remember that photographers got into the surrealism game too. We've seen a couple of works by Lee Miller, an American fashion model who, like Merritt Oppenheim, chose to go behind the lens. She's the woman who said, "I'd rather take a picture than be in one." In Paris, she became the lover, muse, and collaborator of the surrealist photographer Man Ray. The glass tears, those are beads, glass beads on the eyes there. They collaborated so closely in this period that some photographs taken by Miller are actually credited to Man Ray. Some of her works are very, very similar, right? So I'm going to finish on yet another continent, Asia, with a Japanese photographer, Iwata Nakayama, who was born in 1895. Nakayama was the first photography student at the Tokyo University of Arts, and he arrived in California in 1918. He did eventually live in New York and Paris, where he met Man Ray and other avant-garde photographers. But he returned to Japan in 1927 and published a manifesto in which he stated his commitment to pure art photography. He wanted to create something that only photography can produce, and I think he managed to do so. But as European photography began to reach Japan, Nakayama was conflicted. Many of his contemporaries sought modern interpretations of traditional Japanese arts, but he wasn't interested in this approach. Nakayama was determined to stand on equal footing with European and American artists and to invent something novel, to create a scene, he said, through the hallucinogen of photography that could never be witnessed in real life. So he manages to create objects that seem to float in midair in his most experimental work. He obviously combined different negatives together, and he would also do things like use a glass table, put objects above and below the glass to play with depth, and he would use mirrors to create shadows and reflections. But as Japan became more militaristic in the 1930s, most Japanese photographers moved towards a more realistic approach, but not Nakayama. He continued to pursue his avant-garde expression during the lean years of the war. He died in 1949, age 54. So Surrealism is largely a product of the 30s, the mid-years of the century, but never fear, it's not dead. There's a great deal of Surrealism around. For example, I think there's some in China. I think I'd call this a Surrealist work, something that is figurative, easy to determine what the objects are, but we're wondering why they're that way. Or this other work by Zhang Zhaogang, and there's plenty of that. And there's some Surrealism going on in England, I think we could say, in the work of Damien Hirst, such as this wonderful object called For the Love of God. If this isn't a surreal object on the level of the lobster telephone and the fur breakfast, I don't know what is. This is a platinum cast of an 18th century human skull encrusted with 8,600 flawless diamonds, including a pear-shaped pink diamond in the forehead that is known as the Skull Star Diamond. The teeth are original, were purchased by Damien Hirst in London. As he says, the work is a memento mori. And I don't believe it's ever been sold, but it was offered for $50 million. So if you want a surrealist object for your home, this one is available, I think. I'm going to end here. So, oops, I canceled the thing. Very good. I'll stop the share. And if anyone has any questions or comments about these wonderful and interesting works, I'd be glad to try and answer them.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can type it into the Q&A box and we can answer.
Would you personally like a lobster telephone, Suriana? Would you have one of those at home?
I don't have a lobster telephone. I don't know. That one kind of freaks me out a little bit.
It does freak you out?
A little bit, not gonna lie.
How about the fur bracelet? I would totally take the fur bracelet. I love that.
If it wasn't scratchy, I would do it. That would be okay.
Okay.
All right. All right, I'm going to see if anybody's typing anything, but I just want to remind everybody that our next art talk will be on July 11th, and it will be the Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England. The Zoom login is already ready for that if you want to register and join us on Zoom, but we hope to have that also hybrid in person in the council chambers on July 11th. Doesn't look like anyone has any questions,
Okay.
but I want to thank you so much for doing this, Avril, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I hope you enjoy this somewhat summer day outside, and I hope to see you all in the library soon.